Hi everyone, this is the presentation for the paper named Learning Real-Time Ambient Occlusion from Distance Representations. The reason that I chose this topic is that, first of all, I'm really into games and ambient occlusion is one of the techniques used to make the game look more realistic. And AO is pretty much related to ray tracing and other shading techniques which we learned in this course. Here the AO is combined with some machine learning stuff so that it can be done real time without performance degradation. Before we look at the paper, I will make a short explanation about what ambient occlusion is. The basic lighting elements as they are mentioned in Phong illumination consist of ambient, diffuse, specular, and emission lights. The presence of ambient light makes the objects in the real world never be completely invisible, as long as there's any source of light. Even if an object is not under the direct radiance of the light source, the photons scatter around and eventually come into our eyes so we can see the object. But ambient light is not in the same intensity on every object or position. Generally, the more exposed the surface is, the brighter it gets. This is because as the space gets more hidden and deeper, the less photons can get inside. In the images on the right side, you can see the shaded area under the pillar and behind some objects. This kind of visual cues help us recognize the depth of the surfaces, and imitating this real-world phenomenon in computer graphics is called ambient occlusion. Mathematically, ambient occlusion is inversely correlated to the number of reflected rays. If a point P is obscured by the geometry around it, some of the reflectance rays are blocked in their propagating path, which leads to darker appearance of the point. But as you already learned from ray tracing lessons, computing the occlusion of every point in the scene is too expensive to be done in real time. Therefore, many techniques to approximate ambient occlusion are suggested so far. I'm going to briefly talk about the two oldest techniques which were widely used. If you are a gamer just like me, you may already have heard of the term itself. SSAO is the first type of AO technology used for real-time rendering games. After the rasterization process is over, every pixel has its own depth value stored in G buffer, and SSAO uses this value to estimate how much each pixel is forwarded or pulled back. For each pixel, it samples several depth values around and see how many samples are inside and outside the geometry. If most of them are outside the geometry, that means the pixel is somewhere quite exposed on the surface. And if the samples are mostly inside the geometry, that means the pixel is also likely to be obscured by the geometry, which leads to high occlusion. SSAU is known to be very fast because there's no physical computation, but sometimes inaccurate since it does not actually consider the geometry and just guess the occlusion value. A year later, another technique called HBAO came out, further improving the previous SSAO technique. For a single point on the surface, it shoots several sample rays in many different directions which march along the surfaces. The rays then keep updating how much it is elevated compared to the beginning. This elevation is later compared with an angle between tangent on the point and world horizon. The bigger its difference is, the more occlusion value the point is given. But still, HBAO uses some false occlusions if the rays are not uniform enough to cover the geometric features. In the computer graphics, this kind of errors are called artifacts. It will be good for you to remember this term. So after SSAO and HBAO, many researches were additionally made in the AO field, and this paper was made thanks to the contributions of the senior engineers. I chose the most important ones from the reference of the paper and divided them into two tracks. In the machine learning track, real-time rendering adopted machine learning for the first time in 2013, and in 2016, convolutional neural network was applied to ambient occlusion. On the other hand, in 2006, Evans suggested a way to compute the occlusion using signed distance field, which I will cover later, and Wright improved this work in 2015. I will talk about how the two tracks progressed in ambient occlusion field. In 2016, Houghton tried to apply machine learning to SSAO to minimize its errors. Being amateur in machine learning field, I'm going to explain in a very simple manner, so I ask for your understanding. What he tried to do was to make a neural network that takes screen space G-buffer data as input and find the optimal occlusion value for every point in the surface. G-buffer is a screen space representation of geometry and material information. It is generated in rendering pipelines and by geometric shaders. In the image, you can see that original input is divided into 4 channels. Then each element goes through the layers until the iteration is over. Here, the neural network learns which combination of the G-buffer data values yields specific occlusion value. On the other track, in 2006, Evans tried to deduce ambient occlusion value using a data called signed distance field. He said that his approach was enormously inaccurate but looked aesthetically good. If it's so, accuracy is not important anymore, and it also required very little pre-computation, so it worked well in real time as well. Let's see how the method of using SDF helped ambient occlusion rendering in dynamic scenes. Signed distance field is a 3D scalar field describing the distance to the closest surface point at each 3D point, which means that SDF values are written voxel-wise. In the image, you can see that the points on the boundary of the object have the 0 value. The points on the outside have positive values and the points inside the object have negative values. In this research, Evans computed the visibility of the sky using these SDF values. Before we move on, please remember that Evans used the SDF in a different way. That is, now the points inside the object are given positive values, not like in the image on the right side. Here the 0 value points have white color, and as the color gets darker, the point gets away from the closest object surface. You can see that the colors near the object surface are white as I mentioned. What if we don't have anything in the air? Then the SDF value will just decrease as it goes up to the sky. That means we can expect the SDF value of a point depending on its position. Then we have occlusion. Then what? The SDF value changes and we have to take a new obstacle into account as well. Then we have some gaps between expected values and actual values. We can intuitively know that these gaps originated from occlusion. By sampling the points in a linear direction and analyze the gap between expected and actual values, you can approximate the extent of occlusion, and this occlusion size is used to calculate ambient occlusion. Until now, we've seen how ambient occlusion using machine learning and using signed distance representation works. It's very straightforward after that, we just have to combine two tracks. The neural network now takes SDF values as input. Ground truth is an integral of emanated rays over a hemisphere following the basic principle of ambient occlusion. Ground truth is something that we want the network to mimic completely. We wish the network to work just like the basic principle of AO but without complex computations. In other words, we want the neural network to be trained to approximate ambient occlusion using signed distance samples. The training is done on many different scenes to acquire the accuracy of the model. After learning is over, the network is applied in the following order. For every point on the surface, set the surrounding hemisphere and generate sample positions uniformly inside it. Then generate the SDF values of the samples and see how big the gap is between the expected and actual SDF values. Signed distance field for the object can be pre-computed and united even with fully animated meshes, which makes real-time rendering plausible. In this picture, you can see that the trained network using 32 different scenes makes a good approximation of the ground truth, whereas NNAO and HBAO make some incomplete and inaccurate results. The authors then tried to apply their findings to some other fields. Their technique is found out to be able to be used to compute band normals, soft shadows, and so on. Band normal is the average direction of all rays unobstructed by surrounding geometry. In the image, the normal vector is visualized using different colors, as you can see. This normal can be used for global illumination calculations. In addition, their technique can also be used to cast soft shadows. Though soft shadows depend on the whole geometry in the scene, it is said that the technique in this paper can reproduce plausible soft shadows. And here are the limitations presented in the paper. First, this technique requires signed distance representation. This is not a big problem though, since many recent graphic engines like Unreal Engine 4 started to provide such data. Next, this technique depends on training data, and lastly, it may yield wrong results when there are ambiguities in input data. I will show you what those mean using the images. The images on the left side is the point cloud data used for training the network. You can see that the lower image has a pillar structure, while the upper image does not. According to the authors, depending on the object configure of the training scenes, the framework may yield some wrong result, just like the image on the upper right. Here, the pillar object does not cast shadows on the wall. In other words, the quality of AO approximation is highly dependent on the resemblance between training and application scene. And lastly, the ambiguity in input data can be explained with this image. Here, two different scenes have identical sample occlusions, but in fact, the occlusion has to be different in two scenes because the hemisphere on the left side is much more occluded than the one on the right side. This is all I prepared for today's presentation. Thank you.